The Civil War was a bloody war between countrymen, family members, friends, and states. It lasted 4 long years. Its results were catastrophic. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. This resulted in 10 other states following South Carolina. These states include Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. These states later became known as the Confederate States of America. This led to the bombardment of Fort Sumter by the Confederates. The Union battle flag represented cavalry, infantry, regimental, corps, brigades. Some flags signaled things like stop the fighting to clear the field of dead or wounded, surrender, stop and fighting until later. These would also show if you were friendly or enemy, as well as showing where to rally up at. The Union common flag was consisted of 33 stars, and the red, white, and blue were the standard colors. The colors of the common flag represent red, hardiness and valor; white, purity and innocence; blue, no official meaning; stars represented the states. Underneath the uniform, soldiers wore a cotton shirt and cotton underwear. Over that were sky blue wool trousers with braces called suspenders. A dark blue wool sack coat was used by most infantrymen. Cavalry usually wore a shell jacket. Union soldiers higher in rank than infantrymen wore frock coats and greatcoats. Most infantrymen wore forage caps called kepis for fatigue duty. They had a flat circular top and the brim in the front was peaked. Hardy hats were worn as the official dress hat and were black with an eagle pin that kept the left side up. Brogans were ankle-high shoes worn by most soldiers, and gaiters were made of leather that covered boots and kept water and dirt out in wet terrain and bad weather. Soldiers carried a black cotton knapsack that held sections of their tent cloth, extra clothes, a wash kit, and a sewing kit called the housewife. Their waterproof blanket, coated in rubber, was on top. A haversack was worn on their left side and contained food like coffee beans and hardtack. A water canteen was on top. It also held a knife, fork, and spoon. A cartridge pouch held lead bullets and paper cartridges that held gunpowder, and a cap pouch was used to hold metal percussion caps that contained explosives for firing bullets from their rifles. Uniforms differed based on rank. First of all, cavalry wore shorter coats called shell jackets and higher boots to make it easier for riding, and had wider brimmed hats. Sharpshooters wore green to match their surroundings. Field and general officers wore double-breasted coats instead of single-breasted coats. General officers had dark blue frock coats with gold buttons, epaulettes, and a sash. Artillery wore frock coats, carried a rifle called a carbine, and a sword. Army officers could be recognized by their shoulder straps, which were rectangle-shaped and outlined in gold. The inside picture depicts the officer's ranking, and the color of the background displays what part of the army the officer is part of. Enlisted ranks were identified by the chevron stripe located on both sleeves. The more stripes a soldier had, the higher their rank. The chevron's color showed what kind of service they belonged to. Each service stripe below the chevron represented 5 years enlisted. The red or blue around the stripe indicated if it was during wartime. Badges were worn on the left side of the soldier's cap or over their left breast to recognize what branch he belonged to in his regiment. Flags were very important in the Civil War. It was a very big deal if your flag was stolen. The flag also identified groups of men and what unit they belonged to. Their national flag has 13 stars in a circle and 3 stripes. This was the second and final national flag. The battle flag that they mostly use is the one we see today. It is red with an X that includes 13 stars. This flag was based on the rejected proposal of it being the national flag. The Confederate uniforms were usually made from wool and jean fabric. Their shell jacket was colored gray or butternut. Confederates chose the color gray because back then, gray dye was inexpensive. In some early battles, some of the Confederates in different units would wear dark blue uniforms and would often be mistaken as Union soldiers. Gray was then founded as a traditional color in the Civil War militia troops. Soldiers also had to wear a slouch hat or a kepi because these showed what unit they belonged to. Confederates also carried a haversack, which was used to carry rations, a canteen that was usually made from wood due to shortage on metal. A knapsack was a bag designed to carry a range of items, mainly camping equipment. About 400 women successfully enlisted in the war. Women weren't allowed to fight because they were considered the weaker sex, and it was thought that their proper place was at home doing chores, running family businesses or farms, and caring for their children. Most women would still help by volunteering to be nurses and joining the sanitary commission. Some women still did join the war as soldiers by disguising themselves as men. They would do that by changing their name, voice, cutting their hair, growing facial hair, and developing into a man. Jenny Hodges successfully enlisted and was thought as one of the boys in her regiment. She became Albert D.J. Cashier and was found to be a woman after breaking her hip and having to go to the hospital. Another woman soldier was Sarah Rosetta Wakeman.
Some women got caught very easily. A lot of times women got caught because they went to the hospital because they were wounded. Women were able to do their job. If they did their job, nobody was the wiser. One thing about Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, she was never found out. She was never found out as contaminated meat. You're eating fouled up cornbread. Sometimes you don't eat at all.
Soldier life for Civil War soldiers was very tough. Soldiers never got enough food to eat. The food they did eat was hardtack, cornmeal, beef, dried peas, and a coffee-like substance. Nothing fresh was ever eaten. Soldiers did drilling every day. 75% of the soldiers were infantry, and they drilled together as a squad. 20% of the soldiers were part of the cavalry, and 5% of the soldiers were part of the artillery. In their free time, they played rounders, which was baseball. They wrote letters home if they could write. Soldiers played music by the fire. Some would even play drums, bugles, and fifes. Sleep was not the most comfortable. They slept on rugs and homemade pillows and would be woken up at dawn to start their day. Soldiers did get paid. They received about $11 to $13 per month. Some of the money was used to purchase items from the settler, while the rest was sent home to families. There were many greatly used weapons in the Civil War, such as the Colt revolver rifle, the Springfield rifle, and the Lorenz rifle. Ammunition they used were called mini balls. It took about 20 seconds to load a rifle. The North had better weapons than the South because there were more northern factories and could make them shoot up to 40 to 50 yards. The cartridge box held all of the ammunition. The soldiers used caps to help ignite the gunpowder. When the command to load is yelled, the soldier must take out a cartridge from the cartridge box, pull the cover off with his teeth, put the cap on the cartridge, and ram it into his barrel using a ramrod. A bayonet is mounted to the muzzle so the soldier can use the weapon as a spear. The Union was very well supplied and could manufacture guns and artillery for their troops, while the Confederates were not well supplied and had to make their own makeshift artillery. The most common type of artillery in the Civil War were cannons, such as the Napoleon cannon. To load the cannon, gunpowder was shoved into it with a rammer. A cannonball was then pushed down the barrel. Next, someone pulled the lanyard, which called friction, making the cannon fire. A well-trained cannon team could fire 3 to 4 times a minute. Artillery ranged in every branch of the military. Additionally, there was mounted, light, and flying artillery. One part of the army was cavalry. A soldier in the cavalry is someone who rides a horse. Weapons they used were saber, pistols, and multi-shot breech-loading carbines. There were 272 cavalry soldiers in the Union and 137 in the Confederacy. Many of those men brought their own horses, although if they were in need of a horse because their horse died, they didn't want to bring their horse from home, or they didn't have access to a horse, they could buy one at the price of $150. When the horse died, they would strip them of their things that they carried, like the saddle. Some ways the horses died were from artillery fire, being shot about 5 times, or being overworked. After the horse died, the cavalrymen would get a new horse when possible. The cavalry's main job was to scout and guard. The cavalry had some advantages over the infantry, like height, speed, and mobility. Therefore, they could also do other things than just scouting and guarding. For example, they acted as skirmishers, who attracted the enemy's attention and distracted them from the rest of the army. Sometimes they would fill in gaps in the infantry lines or act as raiders. The cavalry were also used as messengers so they could get the news out quickly. Marching was a difficult process for the soldiers to endure. Most of the time, you would see them training rather than taking breaks. Often, soldiers were unorganized due to lack of free time. Some of the commands that soldiers had to adapt to were forward march, which was marching forward. Shoulder arms meant lifting the musket to your shoulder. Attention meant to stand still and place feet in a T position. Face left directed them to turn to the left, and face right meant turning to the right. Drilling and marching was a part of everyday life for the soldiers. The games that soldiers played were boxing, broad jumping, wrestling, foot races, marbles, checkers, dominoes, dice, and rounders, which was similar to baseball. The soldiers also played chess. They usually gambled during these kinds of games for money. When the soldiers gambled, they used a table, a dice, a tin can for the dice, and gambled with beans when they didn't have enough money. Sometimes they would even gamble on lice by racing them. The music they played inspired men to enlist to be a soldier in the war. While in camp, many soldiers played musical instruments brought from their home to help the time pass. They also played music to inspire men before they went to battle. The drummer was a very important person in the infantry. They sounded calls and also walked along the battlefield looking for the wounded and brought them to medical care. Dancing was enjoyed by almost everyone in America during the Civil War. A ball was one way to forget the fiery trial. They also had a lot of fun doing these dances. People danced because it was a tradition. They also danced for enjoyment. Sometimes dancing took place after death to celebrate that person's life. Civil War dances are important because they were a tradition that took place to celebrate when a good decision was made during the war and celebrate the end of the war.
She's fallen a couple times in that dress. I know.
I just want to get because I know
No, the kid with the skateboard you don't want. Okay. I'll figure out. Okay.
Stand right hand, hold on, left to the next person. No, you keep going with this. No.
You know I'll get you on the next one.
A blast of cannon usually jolted the soldiers from their personal thoughts. Most lay motionless on the ground, trying to stop an accelerated heartbeat. If the enemy's artillery was accurate, Many men died where they lay. The order to advance was given, a chance to see the elephant, and the battle lines began moving in regimental blocks, often under heavy artillery bombardment. By this time, the battlefield was a half-blinding fog. In the Civil War, weapons fired black powder, making the ground a haze of smoke. Soon the men found themselves unprotected in the chaos of exploding artillery shells and smoke. If the smoke gradually cleared, they saw ahead, perhaps 100 yards or more, an unbroken line of the enemy, waiting and stiffening for the assault. In the distance, bayonets flashed in the sun and regimental flags snapped in a sharp breeze. Steadily they moved forward, elbow to elbow, only 13 inches apart from the soldiers in front of them. The fighting line would shift to left or right to accommodate gaps in the line left by fallen comrades. The advance continued to move toward the enemy and came within firing range. Each man then hearkened back to weaponry drill in camp. Now the soldiers went through several steps to load their muskets, while they were advancing. One practical step required them to use their teeth to break open a cartridge containing a bullet and gunpowder. Once rifles were loaded, the men started firing. Hopefully, in this frantic exchange of musket fire, the rifles would not misfire or jam. Meanwhile, enemy shells and bullets shredded the ranks of the attackers. The situation then turned chaotic and disorganized. A few men during this part of the battle became panicky and tried to slip away unnoticed. If caught, these deserters would regret their mid-battle decisions, for they would eventually be disgraced and punished. Confusion in battle made it difficult to determine which side was winning. Focused on the men in front of them, few ever had a chance to stop and observe the battle and draw any conclusions. The turning point in most Civil War battles occurred when either the charge penetrated the enemy's flank or center and broke through, or an officer gave the command retreat or pull back. At that point, the troops skillfully extricated themselves from the combat and ran, or swiftly walked back across the corpse-laden field to where the original charge began. A victory came from the penetrating the enemy lines, whereupon the line broke and enemy soldiers retreated from their positions. Afterward, the assault troops rounded up prisoners, confiscated all weapons, and occupied the region. Victory and not, Civil War battles were ugly and heartbreaking. The medical field was never dull, and neither were their tools. The nurses and doctors used many different tools such as surgical scalpels, straight forceps, amputation knives, crimpers, bone saws, and fallout forceps. The nurses and doctors could do anything from facial reconstruction to amputation. They used a variety of methods such as gunpowder and alcohol for snakebite victims, to whiskey to stop the pain. The other painkillers they had were chloroform. The sanitation was a 1 out of 5 stars. They did not disinfect the tools and went from one amputation to another. For every 3 soldiers killed in battle, 5 died of camp diseases.
Means of styling how they were taking care of the soldiers. And
Okay, I'm going to talk about two.
that's basically how the nursing came about, because in 1861 the Union developed its nursing corps with the help of a lady by the name of Dorothea Dix. She had been working in a mental hospital, and she was asked to oversee the development. Nurses didn't get developed. Nursing establishment didn't get started until 1862, and the men and women that stayed behind, they thought it would be a great honor to make sure that they took care of the boys by making sure that they had the supplies and things that they needed to get better. Once they were injured, they would gather hospital supplies and medications. Now the sanitary commission, there were 2 commissions. There was the sanitary commission and the Christian commission. The Christian commission helped out in the hospitals as well as the sanitary commission. I like to think of it as they were doing it to help save the boys' souls, whereas the sanitary commission was just making sure that things were as clean and orderly.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall have not died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. On the evening of Good Friday, April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, his wife, and two guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Miss Clara Harris, attended Ford's Theater to see Our American Cousin. John Wilkes Booth, a regular at Ford's Theater, had learned of this earlier in the day. Booth, David Harold, Louis Payne, and George Atzerodt planned simultaneous attempts on the lives of President Lincoln, Secretary of State Seward, and Vice President Johnson. At about 10:15 p.m., Booth approached the door to the presidential box. Because General Grant had declined an invitation to the play, there was no military escort at the theater, only Lincoln's bodyguard, who, perhaps with Lincoln's knowledge, had stepped away. Booth opened the door, shot Lincoln once in the back of the head, slashed the unarmed Rathbone with a hunting knife, and leapt 12 feet to the stage below. Booth's spur caught the U.S. Treasury Guard's flag on the way down, and he severely injured his leg. He limped out of the rear exit and escaped on a horse held for him by stagehand Edmund Spangler. The unconscious Lincoln was brought across the street to the house of William Peterson. The other two assassination attempts failed. Atzerodt lost his nerve and Payne was overpowered before reaching the bedridden Seward. President Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. After shooting the president, Booth left from the presidential box to the stage. Stopping in front of the audience, he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning, "So perish all tyrants." He ran out the backstage where a horse was waiting for him. Later that night, Booth and a fellow conspirator, David Harold, who had caught up to him, arrived at Mary Surratt's Tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, where they picked up supplies. After traveling for hours, they arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who attended to Booth's broken leg. They were later demanded to leave when Mudd learned of the assassination. Booth and Harold ventured throughout the countryside, hiding in woods and swamps, the sound of the hooves of their pursuers' horses always nearby. It would be 10 days after the night of the 14th, and 95 miles from Washington, before Booth arrived at Garrett's farm, where 2 days later he ultimately would be captured and killed. The four co-conspirators were sentenced to death by hanging for their involvement in Lincoln's assassination. After 4 long years, the Civil War officially came to an end. Overall, more than 620,000 human beings were killed, 470,000 wounded, and 400,000 missing. There were over 1.5 million casualties between both sides. To Today, historians are finding that the death toll is even higher, considering many died from infection or disease caused by their wounds. For every 3 soldiers that died in battle, 5 more died of disease. The Civil War cost the North $6 billion and the South $2 billion. Up to this date, the United States has preserved around 34,000 acres of battlefield land. Ask yourself this question: was all of that bloodshed worth it?